Kerry Hinsby. I'm a consultant psychologist over in the forensic services, and I'll let Fiona introduce herself while I admit some more people.
Okay, thanks, Kerry. Hi, everybody. It's good that so many of you could come today. Some of you maybe will know me. I'm Fiona Lowis, and I'm consultant psychologist for working age adult community services.
We've mentioned a few of the housekeeping. Please turn your mics off, and that we're recording. We've got about an hour aside for this. We'll hopefully take some questions as we go through. What we want to do is really give you some practical information as well as some knowledge around some of the sort of trauma reactions that some of our staff and ourselves may be experiencing, given everything that we're facing at the moment. The hope is these things at the end of it, that you'll have, as I've said, just some practical information, but also some knowledge. A lot of us who are clinicians will probably hold the knowledge in terms of how we work with our service users, but really thinking about how we can apply that knowledge to ourselves and our colleagues. So helping us make that transition from colleagues, from service users to colleagues. Some of you that may have attended the webinar that I did on psychological first aid, gosh, probably way back in March, April time, may have been familiar with this diagram, and you may have actually seen it in other contexts as well. It really just gives what I think is quite a nice visual summary of how we can support staff and staff wellbeing at any time really, but particularly in response to COVID. The idea being really at the bottom two layers are the kind of foundation, basic interventions that really all staff can benefit from. And as we move up the triangle, some of the more specific focused interventions that we would probably signpost people onto. This talk from myself and Fiona will very much focus on the bottom two layers and builds upon the psychological first aid knowledge that was in the last webinar. What I also added to this one, which I think is so important and that Fiona and I will refer to throughout, is the idea of these things occurring in the right environment and the right system. So it's all well and good having these great interventions, but if we're not in the right system and we're not in the right environment, they pretty much land flat on their face. And our roles of employees, colleagues, helps to create the right environment and the right system. So we'll be making lots of reference to that as well. And I think in particular, this idea is destigmatizing mental health or just struggling. I think as healthcare workers, we're probably the worst at looking after ourselves, and we're hard on ourselves if we experience anything at less than sort of superhero status. So we're really trying to create an environment where that shame and that stigma is reduced. I'll just admit someone else and move on to the next slide. So a couple of slides of statistics that I don't want to overwhelm you with, but really just to highlight the context. This is all about post-trauma reactions. We're not talking about general mental health, we're talking about trauma and reactions to trauma. And as we can see on this slide, the rates for frontline responders, which includes us as frontline staff, the rates of formal PTSD are up between 10 and 20%. So if we look at collectively at all the studies, it's very well researched and evidenced that we have a much higher rate of diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder occurring in all frontline responders. And that's gathered from a whole range of different mass incidents or serious incidents and crises that occurred. If we try and drill down into the pandemic, into COVID, and then again, even more specifically in terms of NHS staff, we've got some really new and emerging statistics that are appearing and confirming that picture really, and really quite worrying rates. So if we look at this little bit in the middle, NHS staff, what we see here for the formal post-traumatic stress disorder, so this is the real sort of peak of the triangle, something like 24% of NHS staff are experiencing this compared to 4% of the general population. And that's now, that's in response to COVID. And that's the tip of the iceberg. There'll be a whole range of staff that might not meet the diagnostic threshold, but are struggling. And this talk is not just about the people at the top of the diagnostic peak, but actually a lot of the people that sit underneath that. I think it's really timely. We're giving this talk today. It wasn't planned in this way by any means, but what we know is that people often run on adrenaline. We just keep going. And it's actually when we start to relax that some of these symptoms and experiences can really surface. And it's my kind of opinion, really, with the vaccine appearing and we're starting to get seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, that some of that adrenaline will start to ease off. And I think we'll probably start to see some of these symptoms and experiences and reactions emerging more and more so. So whilst it's great that we're celebrating V-Day yesterday, I think it's really timely that we keep our eye on these things now. So I'll just admit somebody else. Close that and move on to the next page. Don't want to spend ages on this, but I think it's a really useful infographic in general. It's designed by the King's Fund, who are a massive think tank, and they released this probably about a month ago, looking at what we can do in general for staff health and well-being. What I want to do is draw your attention to what's sitting on that. I don't know if you can see my cursor moving, but what they're recommending here in this top left corner is providing not general mental health training, but trauma training. And we'd started plotting this webinar before this came out. So we like to think we're ahead of the curve here, that we've got this being able to deliver it in a timely way. The other key box is this one over on the right-hand side, which is just a timely reminder, really, that don't rush to use psychological interventions. That tip of the triangle that we talked about, don't feel you need to rush into doing that or signposting people there. What we're talking about is the bottom two bits of the triangle, which is really creating the right environment and the right systems around people. A key message slide. You've probably heard this expression before, and we really wanted to put it in our subtitle to really hammer home that message. It's okay not to be okay. We are living in extraordinary times with real challenges on a day-to-day basis, both in an acute way, a chronic way, inside work, outside of work. The reactions that we're all having are normal reactions to abnormal times. So it's okay not to be okay. Some of these reactions are actually adaptive. It's our body's way, our mind's way of managing stress. Lots of them will just subside naturally. That's absolutely fine. Some of them might not. And that's where we'll talk through that. And that's where you might signpost. The reason for doing this talk is not just to understand it, but one of the most important intervening factors is having the right conversations at the right time, with the right people and in the right system. So we're hoping to skill you up really in terms of and just reminding people really what those conversations might look like and how we can help each other. Staff wellbeing is everybody's business, and if you're a manager or a leader, you're absolutely key in terms of increasing someone's stress or protecting against someone's stress. So again, just a key reminder, if we keep repeating the mantra, it's okay not to be okay. I guess what Fiona and I wanted to do before I hand over to her is just bring it probably a little bit closer to home and make it a little bit more personal to our trust and to our experiences. There were two experiences that come to my mind in the forensic service when I was preparing this talk, and I think it really illustrates the cumulative effect of trauma and the accumulative chronic nature of what we're living through. Probably most of you will know and remember that right at the beginning of the pandemic, the forensic services lost a number of the nursing team. And of course, there was the grief and the bereavement around that, but there was also a lot of anger, confusion, fear, helplessness, trauma. Do we come to work, not go to work? It was the context in which it occurred was just magnifying that normal and typical grief response. And then a more recent event when we were preparing this talk was around, we have a COVID corridor within the forensic service where if there was a patient or a service user testing positive for COVID, that's where they would receive their care. So we did have one of those service users. He was also very unwell and did at a point in time require restraining, which is awful enough in itself. It's potentially traumatic for the service user, it's potentially traumatic for the staff. But in this particular incident, staff lost their PPE equipment, so they were physically injured, but had the added trauma to deal with of not knowing whether they'd contracted COVID at that point in time. And at this point in time, there was a delay in getting test results back. So again, living with the anxiety and the uncertainty. And when you think about the cumulative effect, this was again within a service that had lost a member of staff to COVID. So you can see how some of those acute stressors are sitting within a kind of chronic context. I'll hand over now to Fiona, who will pick up and talk from her experiences and understanding trauma in a little bit more detail.
Okay, thanks, Kerry. So just to sort of describe some typical experiences in community settings, people have the experience of working in a really busy and stretched community mental health team, where caseload sizes are likely to be increased, at least at times. We've also got the issue of redeployment. And for those people who have been redeployed, being in a strange and difficult environment and perhaps not known by the teams that they've gone to very well. And there'll also likely to be different tolerances to events that happen. So something that's frequent or typical on a ward environment can be really new and unfamiliar to someone coming into that environment from outside. For those teams who have had people redeployed away, will probably also be adapting to extra workload and possibly new tasks which they're less familiar with. There's also probably less time to spend with service users, and because of the restrictions, fewer face-to-face contacts. And that can mean that people can feel like they're sort of unable to meet their own expectations or their service users' expectations, or that the parts of the work that feel the most meaningful and effective are really compromised. There might be fewer opportunities to feel with developing relationships or to get a really good sense of people and how they're coping. And that in itself can feel really stressful. There might be increased clinical risk for service users as mental health acuity can increase. And also there's less time to connect with your teams, to process, to think, to get support. So it's a time when we probably need even more opportunity to think and be together. The opportunities are much more limited. When we're all under high levels of stress, that can mean that your sort of emotional availability is compromised. And so I think in community settings, there are particular challenges about not being in the sort of physical proximity with one another. And although remote working brings a lot of advantages, many of which we'll retain, it does make keeping connected more challenging. And finally, there are less clear boundaries between home and work issues. So the very things that you might be having to deal with in your work life, they're also present in your home life, your personal life. So that boundary is really difficult to maintain. Now we're going to come back to these experiences in a short while, but before we do, if we look at the sorts of experiences and behaviours that we might be aware of. Kerry, next slide, please. I've been dying to say that. Okay, so let's be really clear here. It's not our role or our remit to diagnose our colleagues. So these are just descriptions, and they'll hopefully help us to achieve.
It's fine. I'm on. It's like a webinar. So.
Sorry,
I think we can hear you.
We can hear you, Fiona. Could you mute, please?
Oh, sorry.
No worries. Okay, so these are just descriptions that will hopefully help us to attune us to the things that can happen. We're not saying that they definitely will happen, but they certainly can happen so that we can react and respond with compassion and with insight. Okay, so the first sort of area to look at is the acute stress response. And what we mean by that is anxiety, fear, low mood, possibly increased drug or alcohol use, poor concentration and memory. And this is usually a temporary state, And it's normal and it's appropriate given the situation and the context that we are all in and have been for such a long time now. And I'm sure that all of us at some time will have experienced some of these symptoms described. Now, acute stress can develop in response to a single big event or a succession of more chronic events, kind of like a cumulative effect. They're dependent on our sort of individual vulnerability and our coping skills. But what the evidence tells us that if an acute stress response is there for more than a month, then there's an increased chance of developing post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's relatively rare, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. The second area is burnout. And what we mean by that is exhaustion, cynicism, impaired decision making. And again, this is something which you probably will have seen in people and possibly recognise in yourself at times. And this is an issue which we'll need to be aware of now. And I think, as Kerry mentioned before, particularly when there seems to be light at the end of the tunnel, we might just kind of let our guards down. Okay, now thirdly, moral injury. Now this is a term that originated in the military, and it refers to actions which kind of conflict with our conscience, with our moral code. And in our current situation, I think if moral injury occurs, it's likely to be around not being able to deliver the care to the same standards or in the same way that we're used to. Things might seem unrealistic or unachievable. And we might have dilemmas and decisions and conflicts around aligning our care for our service users with aligning the need to protect our own health and our own family's health. And finally, to describe post-traumatic stress disorder, and I'll do this in terms of three main clusters of symptoms. Firstly, we have avoidance. So this can mean physical avoidance, people not wanting to come to work or perform specific tasks. Or it could be more emotional avoidance, people avoiding talking about things that have happened or thinking about or connecting with our experiences. And it can be more challenging if people find it harder to just keep going if they're going to talk about their experiences. Things can feel a lot safer at a distance. But avoidance can be problematic because what it can do is maintain that cycle of anxiety and fear. Okay, secondly, hyperarousal. Now, what we mean by that is it's a sort of an agitated, nervous state. People find it really hard to kind of calm down and to calm down. It's a state of being constantly on guard and in anticipation of threat, kind of like a smoke detector, which is too sensitive to threat and it just keeps going off all the time. And it prepares us for fight or flight, even if the situation might not warrant it. So it's kind of like the fire engine comes screeching round when you've burnt your toast. It's not when we need that to happen, but it's triggered in any case. And there's so many triggers for us at the moment. And it's really exhausting and it's really difficult to achieve a state of rest and relaxation. And thirdly, intrusive symptoms, and these are probably the ones you'll have heard about the most. And these are experiences which are uninvited and over which we have little control. It can be things like intrusive memories, which just come into your mind, or even more distressing experiences like flashbacks, when we're reliving or re-experiencing something that's happened to us. Nightmares can wake us from sleep and they're really distressing and disorienting and they can take a while to recover from, never mind disrupting the restorative sleep as well. So experiences are not stable and contained and they can kind of overspill into our everyday experiences. It's a little bit like emotional indigestion where because you haven't chewed something up properly, it kind of gets stuck and kind of repeats on you. Okay, next slide, please, Kerry.
She's trying to do it. This is right. I do not understand. Let's try that bottom button instead. There we go.
Wonderful.
Via the mouse rather than the keyboard. Plan B.
Thank you. Okay, so in terms of the previous slide about the sort of different things that we might be looking out for and need to be aware of, knowing more about risk factors could probably really help us improve our awareness of ourselves and of our colleagues. Knowing our staff and their circumstances will help us to be more sensitive and receptive to distress and struggling, and certainly noticing changes in people's behaviours. And this is never more true than with new people joining the trust. So again, the key is around noticing change. It's also really pertinent to situations of redeployment where staff are not known well by the new teams that they might be in. Now, there may be little we feel we can do about these risks, but nevertheless, our awareness of them might help us to prepare or anticipate better the reactions and the responses people have. So I'm going to describe these risk factors in terms of personal, occupational and organisational. So, and this is taken from the evidence about the people who might be more susceptible to having a traumatic stress response. So being parents increases vulnerability, homeschooling, worrying about your kids, worrying about contagion, being isolated, having a pre-existing mental health problems or history of trauma, losing an income, and that can increase the pressure of having to keep going and having to carry on, aside from the other sort of general stresses that can create. Suffering a bereavement, and also your personal coping style. In terms of occupational, the evidence tells us that being a nurse increases vulnerability. But we need to be really clear here that evidence is taken from physical healthcare settings where the proximity to illness and to death is greater. So in our organisation, it translates to those people who have perhaps more contact with people who've been poorly or people who've died. And being inexperienced and being young. Organisationally, lacking PPE, having changes to normal protocols, not feeling a sense of control, being assigned to unfamiliar tasks and having long hours and lack of rest, all things which we need to be aware of, which will increase somebody's risks. Okay, now let's look at a model for how we process our experiences and how this changes when they're stressful. Thanks. Okay, so we understand traumatic stress to be something that occurs when the normal system of processing events becomes compromised. Now, we're all used to being in roles which can be emotionally demanding and at times really stressful, and we're all used to working in systems that can feel stressed and feel challenging at times. But COVID has both increased the amount of stresses and challenges, whilst at the same time reducing our opportunities for connection and human contact. Okay, so this is a metaphor for understanding how our minds naturally process our experiences. So the mind will naturally and automatically put itself right following distressing events. So just like the body, if we fall and graze ourselves, it'll naturally and automatically heal itself. This is the reason that most people can endure and recover from great adversity. And this is what happens to most of us most of the time. So put really simply, we've got experiences going into the factory. So this is the top part of the slide. We've got experiences going into the factory. The factory, our brains process it through thinking and talking, sharing things with others. And these experiences then get nicely stored away in our memories. They're stories with a beginning, a middle and an end. They're time-tagged and we know that they're past. But moving to the bottom diagram, the system gets stuck when it's overwhelmed, and there's a lot to overwhelm us at the moment. So the traumatic event is just too big for the factory to process, and it kind of gets stuck. And then the result can be the acute stress and the burnout and the post-trauma symptoms described earlier. Okay, next slide, please, Kerry. Okay, so let's look at the summary of the threat response. Now, here's a slide identifying at the top the hyperarousal, the fight or flight response of the sympathetic nervous system. So in this zone, we're likely to feel agitated or angry if we're in fight, or panic worry and concern in flight, as our bodies prepare either to fight or to run away, and we become unable to think or communicate clearly. And it's really important to note that in this zone, new learning can't take place. Down at the bottom, the freeze response, and this is the parasympathetic nervous system. It's our more primitive response of shutting down, of playing dead. And it's a response which usually comes into play when the fight or flight response is not available. We detach, we zone out, we disconnect. And just like the hyperarousal, in this zone, new learning can't take place. Okay, so here in the middle between them is the window of tolerance. And this is where our nervous systems are calm enough to engage. We can be present, and we can think, and we can connect. And this is the space for learning and being able to relate to one another. Our bodies are regulated, and our emotions, whatever they are, and remember, this is not about necessarily feeling okay, but it's being okay to connect with whatever it is that we are feeling. So the window of tolerance is where the ventral vagus nerve is in charge, and the things that stimulate the ventral vagus nerve is connection with one another, eye contact, human voice. And this is a space where new learning can take place. Okay, so it's okay not to be okay. It's normal and expected not to be some of the time. Okay, so new slide, please. Next slide, please, Kerry. So let's look at this and see how it applies to our case study. So in the case study that Kerry talked about, the experience of being close to somebody who has died is likely to lead to states of hyperarousal and intrusive thoughts and images. People may have found themselves wanting to avoid work or the sensory triggers that took them back to being in traumatic situations. They may have avoided thinking or talking about what happened, wanting instead to keep going and not having the chance or taking the opportunities to process their experiences. People may be coming into work and facing constant reminders of what happened, and so anxiety and fear are maintained by unavoidable triggers. And this could then lead to a more shutting down, avoidant, a response to threat from the freeze response part of the system. Similarly, from community example, high caseloads, long hours, it can all feel really overwhelming. The opportunity to connect with our service users is compromised, as can opportunities to connect as a team, have a think together, have a laugh together, and to process our experiences. So the challenge here is to be aware of the likely threat and stress responses people feel and the factors that might make somebody more susceptible, so that the opportunities to create the time in the window of tolerance, in that middle bit, for learning and reflection are increased. I know that Kerry's going to refer later to how to have conversations with colleagues about trauma, and the techniques that Kerry's going to talk about will also help put and keep people in that window of tolerance, the space for learning. Okay, Kerry, back over to you.
Thank you. Just before I start, in the chaos of starting pages not turning and admitting people in, I forgot to say, a few of you have already started to use it. Use the chat function. Between myself and Fiona, we will be monitoring it for questions. I did have a quick look and there's no questions at the moment, but we'll try and build in some time at regular intervals and at the end to round up. So pops anything in chat if you've got any particular questions. So thank you, Fiona. What I want to do in the next section is, as Fiona said, just really have some thinking about practical skills. The main practical part is the environment and the systems that we work in. Now, I know there's an awful lot of talk about resilience training and giving staff resilient skills. I've drawn a little picture, well, I haven't drawn it, I can't claim it, but there's a little picture of an igloo, and it just brings to mind really that that little Eskimo can have all the resilient skills in the world, but if he or she is trying to survive in a hostile environment and doesn't build the right environment around them, i.e. the igloo, all those resilient skills are of no use whatsoever, and the environment will literally kill them off. And I think it's just a really nice analogy when we're thinking about resilience skills. They are important, but if we don't get the environment right, they are tokenistic and they won't help us to survive in a challenging and difficult environment. So keeping the environment safe, calm, understanding, compassionate, having all of that running through our systems and our organisation are just as important, if not more important, than any individual resilience skills. In terms of accessing support, what the evidence tells us about staff in terms of what the blocks are, is, as Fiona's mentioned, just having time to stop, and that might be stop to have a wee, it might be stop to have a cup of tea and have a quick chat, but it might also be lack of time to access formal support. We've also talked about reducing the stigma. So as healthcare support workers, we know a little bit about what's out there. Sometimes that can be helpful to us, sometimes it isn't helpful. This superhero label that seems to have flown our way with Clap for Carers and our NHS heroes is wonderful in terms of a short-term morale boost, but I can't help but think and worry a little bit about what it does to the expectations that we put upon ourselves in terms of being over and above the norm, performing over and above everybody else. And I was listening to a webinar the other day and someone said, even superheroes need to take their capes off and wash them. And I thought that was a really nice little reminder that even superheroes, even if we're given that label that is above and beyond, even the superheroes need the time for self-care, to take their capes off and to look after themselves. And then the final thing that often blocks people is knowing where the resources are. So again, as teams and as managers and colleagues, it's helping to signpost people when appropriate. So it really is just reiterating the slide that the environment, the systems, the organisation are just as important as anything we do to individually equip our staff. If we're talking about the environment, then the conversations that we have, almost to ourselves, but importantly for this, to each other, are as a really critical part of making the environment safe and supportive. Now, I've borrowed this acronym from Neil Greenberg. He's a psychiatrist who formerly worked in the army, who obviously is used to working with and understanding trauma, both from an army perspective and from a clinical perspective. There are numerous other acronyms out there, but this one seems particularly fitting for this webinar. It's also being endorsed by NHS. He's as part of a big training program that he's backed, and the NHSE are also supporting that. So I think it's probably a timely one to give some thought to. It's a nice easy one, REACT, and I'll take you through the different steps. So the first one is recognise, and I won't spend any longer on this because Fiona's done a beautiful explanation in terms of what it looks like in line with that hyperarousal and low arousal levels. But I guess that what's important to understand is those individual symptoms or reactions or experiences exist on a continuum. They're normal responses to crisis. And I guess, and it's, as Fiona alluded to, it's that they'll be different for individuals, but knowing our staff, knowing our colleagues helps us understand a difference for them. So recognition is holding in mind what those typical reactions might look like, but equally recognising individual differences and what they look like in our colleagues. Another kind of thing to hold in mind when you're thinking about recognising and keeping an eye out for these is this final point. And whenever I've done debriefs with staff that have had acute trauma, if one message that they take away is from experience any of this hyperarousal or low arousal, any of these reactions, does not mean you're a bad nurse. It doesn't mean you're a bad doctor. It doesn't mean you're a bad psychologist, OT, healthcare support worker. It simply means you're reacting to abnormal events. And I think if there's one level of reassurance to hold in mind, that's a really important message when we're seeing these changes in our staff. It doesn't mean they're bad or weak. So that's recognising, the R. The E is engage, and I think we are far better at doing this with our service users, but we're always a little bit more hesitant with our colleagues. Are we crossing a boundary? Are we interfering? Are we being inappropriate? But this model, and I think it's right to say, don't just recognise, don't stop at that point, don't just notice, but actually reach out to your colleague and have the conversation. You won't make it worse. I think if we look back to how we thought about talking about suicide or talking about voices, we used to think it would make it worse with engaging with people. This is similar. It's the reassurance, the myth busting. Talking to our colleagues won't make it worse. It's a buffer. So that's engage. The A is active listening. So how do we engage? So we've noticed something, we've taken that step forward to reach out. How do we engage? What I want to do is concentrate on the bottom part of this slide, because I think we all know how to actively listen and how to have a good conversation. We need to just make that leap to do it with our colleagues rather than our service users. And this second slide, the second half of the slide, just gives a few little pointers to how to actively listen and how to listen with purpose in the context of trauma. Hopefully this webinar gives you a little bit of information around educating and normalising some of those experiences. Again, I think in terms of that education and knowledge, we're really good with our service users. We are far less good at recognising it in ourselves and recognising it in our colleagues. So just being that listening ear that can hold that bridge is really important. What Fiona talked a lot about was being in that zone of the window of tolerance, the zone of tolerance where you're calm enough. So that the bottom point is to feel calm. If nothing else in the conversation, it's allowing someone to feel calm so they can listen and learn and start to think a little bit differently. So if nothing else, and certainly the British Red Cross, which a huge part of their mission is going into crisis situations, their acronym is actually CALMA. And it's just a really clear reminder that at any point of any conversation is just helping someone to feel calm so they can digest and act on new information. I particularly like the empathy bridge. You may have heard of it before, but it's this bridge between feeling and doing. And the idea that if we can listen with empathy to someone, that person feels understood. That understanding leads to trust, and ultimately that trust is likely to lead to actions. We do it all the time with our service users. Again, it's applicable to working and talking to colleagues. And the final bullet point with the double stars is really, if in doubt, just ask that person what they need most at this point in time. What do you need right now? How can I help you now? What's the most important thing happening to you now? And that literally just focuses people on the here and now and brings them back to the moment and helps you understand what's most important to them. This slide is a direct translation from the one I did on psychological first aid. And again, I won't spend ages on it because it is, we hold all these things, but as we're having conversations, but again, they're all here in one place for ease. The 2 points probably that are most salient when we're thinking about trauma is these ones in the right-hand column. It's this balance between we're not pathologizing, we are normalizing these reactions. And whilst the evidence base and the treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder is really positive and with really good outcomes, so there's a hopeful message there, what we equally don't want to do is give people false hope and false promises and promise things that we can't do or can't deliver on. So I think, again, it's just worth holding those in mind when we're doing that active listening. The, where are we? React. The C is check risks. And again, we're very good at doing this with our service users, risk of harm to themselves, risk of harm to others. We probably are more cautious doing it with our colleagues, but it's right to hold it in mind. Our colleagues are not superheroes and they are vulnerable and particularly vulnerable at these times. Those risks could be things like, is someone picking up your kids? Can you get home safely? Some of the other ones that are a little bit more worrying, we know that harm to children and domestic violence have all increased at the time of COVID. Are any of our colleagues vulnerable to any of these risks? It's just holding it in mind and considering it when you're having those conversations. So check the risks. The final bit is the action element. Talk about actions. And this is where, again, as we would do with our service users, we move from the talking to the doing. There are needs-based actions, which is almost the kind of practical support and thinking through options. So once someone's in that calm zone where they can think a little bit and digest new information, you might want to do some problem solving with them at a very low level. What needs to happen first? What help do you need? What resources have you got around you? Key one, don't do anything drastic when you're in this really this really hyper alert phase. Don't make life-altering decisions. You know, put a pause on those. Probably what's equally relevant is the second section, which are more the kind of psychological or the mental based coping. Again, they're all skills that we would use within our clinical work, and they're just as important in our colleague-to-colleague conversations. We've talked about normalising. Anticipatory guidance, again, this is the idea that don't be surprised if you have difficulty sleeping. Don't be surprised if you find yourself with some of your more unhelpful coping strategies, if your drinking goes up a little bit. Certainly, again, when I do some of the debriefing, and I'll say, you know, if there's been a very acute incident, and I might say something like, you know, how many people remember getting home that at the end of that shift? And there's this sort of a visible relief across the group, and people are there going, oh my goodness, I have no idea how I got home. That like low level of arousal, almost dissociation. They're functioning, they've got home, but they're not present in the moment. So again, it's normalizing and naming some of the things that people might experience. A massive one at the moment, Fiona talked about re-triggering. It might be some of the places at work are re-triggering. I think I shared on the psychological first aid talk that with the nurse that had died, the last time I saw him was at the bottom of the stairs where I go to my office, and it's on the edges of the wards. And I have a beautiful memory of a great big smile and a morning, Kerry. And the next time I came into work, I hadn't thought about that scenario at all. The next time I came into work, I had a really, really powerful flashback to that moment. And in some ways it was lovely. It was a lovely memory. It wasn't a traumatic memory, but it was a really kind of, it was a very, it happened. It wasn't expected and it wasn't planned. It was a nice one and I could understand it, but you can really imagine how some of those experiences could be far more unpleasant and unwelcome and intrusive. So there may be triggers in the work environment. It might be the environment, it might be smells, it might be particular rooms. Think about what the work environment might be re-triggering. But also at the moment, things like social media, and thinking about COVID and how people are responding to COVID, it's all over the place. You might want to kind of talk to staff about minimising some of that re-triggering. And holding in mind signposting, it's, as Fiona said right at the beginning, it's not our job to diagnose staff, but we could be helpful in terms of saying, have you thought about this? Did you know this employee assistant programme was available? Did you know about lead suicide bereavement services? Have you looked at StaffNet for the Health and Wellbeing Hub? Just signposting people. Okay, let's trying to go on to the next slide. And the next steps, again, it's linking back to Fiona and what Fiona has said and the principles. If we're doing actions, what we really want to do is not rescue people, not take the situation out of people's control, but empower them. So what's going to happen next? What do you want to do? What would you like me to do? Hold risks in mind. So if there are any really worrying risks of concern that you don't feel you can keep to yourself, work it out with the person you're talking to. How shall we manage this? Fiona mentioned this active monitoring period, so in the new NICE guidelines, which is the idea of with these reactions are normal, and we don't want to interfere with the natural processing of difficult events. But equally, if people are very severely distressed or that period of 1 month stretches, you may want to do something a little bit more specific and direct towards interventions. But in that period of roughly a month, how are you going to keep an eye on things? How's that individual going to watch themselves, and who around them needs to keep an eye on them to see how things are and talk to them? So what closing your conversation will be, what happens next following this conversation. So there's no secrets, there's no surprises. I think that's my last slide. Yes. So I'll hand over to Fiona, who's probably had a little bit of an eye on the chat, and if there's any particular questions, or we'll save them to the end.
Just one question, Kerry, from Rebecca, just based on one of the things that you mentioned. What are breakout rooms? How do they work? And where are they in our setting?
There's lots of different questions in there and lots of different answers. So the breakout rooms, I think they got called wobble rooms at one point early on in the pandemic. Lots of people didn't like them, but they are the idea, or historically they were staff rooms. They were the idea being that they are just a space off of the ward, so particularly in a ward environment. They're a safe, quiet space that's easily accessible, where you can potentially have some of these conversations, or just have a moment to yourselves, just to start to regulate yourself or have those conversations. In terms of where they are, I think, like a lot of when we talk about organisational structures and being the right environment, I think it's probably fair to say some of those spaces have been squeezed or devalued. I know we've lost some of ours, and we've got outpatient rooms now rather than a cafe in the Newsom Centre. So I think they are scarce. I think the Trust recognises there's a need for them. And certainly when the call went out for charitable funds for staff wellbeing, a lot of people came back saying, we need these systems, we need these environmental spaces, and we need them to look nice and to feel nice. So I think they hopefully, if they're not there, they are emerging, but the evidence suggests having these safe, quiet, calming spaces where staff can just reset themselves and have these conversations is critical really at these times.
We call them window of tolerance rooms, perhaps.
Yeah, we could rebrand them.
Rebecca, does that answer your question? Okay, well, come back in the chat.
Yeah.
Oh yes, Rebecca says thank you. Okay, lovely, thank you. Okay, yeah, and there's a comment there that there's one in the perinatal mental health service, which I created. Excellent, that's good news.
Yeah.
Okay. Should we move on to the last slide, Kerry?
Are you doing this bit, Fiona, support for yourself? Am I doing this bit? I thought you.
Well, I did. Sorry, it wasn't the. I think there's the final summary slide.
You want to just go on to that? Yep. I mean, I guess this slide really is just saying what we've said all along, that you need to look after yourself before you can look after other people, and the oxygen masks are really a really good metaphor for that. Really, that we need to nourish ourselves before we can look after other people.
And I think it's about leading by example, isn't it, as well? And if you're okay and looking after yourself, it's the right message to be given to others.
Absolutely. Okay, I'll just go on to the last slide then for you, Fiona.
Okay, so the main message to take away from today, it's okay not to be okay. So nobody's saying that this is easy or straightforward. But if we tell ourselves it's not okay to feel how we feel, it's going to be much more harmful and difficult. Okay, there is learning that we can take from other situations, which can help us to understand much better why we feel that the way that we do, and in particular, what challenges people may be facing. We've looked at a model of the threat response to help make sense of how traumatic stress can affect us, so that we can recognise it better in ourselves and in others. Kerry's talked about various ways that we can have conversations about traumatic stress with our teams, or with our colleagues, and how these methods allow us to re-access the window of tolerance, a place where we're able to connect and process our experiences. And finally, and related to the last couple of slides, don't forget about yourself. We need to acknowledge the tolls and the challenges to ourselves in order that we're able to be supportive of others. We all need to make the time and effort to ensure as best we can to preserve and protect our own well-being. Okay, so that's the end of our presentation, and I think we've got just over 5 minutes left. So I think we're going to try and be adventurous, and if anybody does have a question that they would like to ask, then you're very welcome to put your hand up emoji or ask something in the chat.
Nothing in the chat at the moment other than a lovely thank you.
Okay, now, Kerry, I can't see everybody.
Yeah, no, I can't see everyone as well. We can keep scrolling through.
Yeah.
Deborah's just asked, are the slides saved? That's a good question. The recording will go onto StaffNet under the Staff Wellbeing Hub. I think we should be able to save the slides there as well as a visual reminder. So we can look to that and save it in the same place.
Okay.
Thumbs up from Deborah. So Eva is asking, have you any advice on how to support with long-standing trauma responses? Fiona, I'll let you take that one.
I think it's a really good question, Eva. I think it depends on sort of I mean, I think that we're talking about the COVID context here, but more broadly, I think it depends on what we're seeing a change in our colleagues. I think it's about the changes in functioning and the safety at work and their personal well-being. But I think when we're talking about the longer-term trauma responses, those things that have gone past that first month of acute stress response, then it will time to be having conversations about what additional support might be necessary. And if you remember Kerry's kind of pyramid of care, it would be to perhaps move up to the next stage of what might be available.
And I think that's where our occupational health colleagues can be really helpful as well. So you'd have the direct psychology intervention, but in terms of if they're well enough to be at work, but what are the reasonable adjustments at work, occupational health are really useful in bridging that and working in partnership with us.
But if we are talking about a longer term trauma response and avoidance is likely to be a part of that, then what we do know is that there probably does need, after that watchful waiting, and there isn't that natural process of recovery, then something probably does need to happen to help that person.
So Mark is P-A-Y, I can't see the surname, has asked, is there anything we can build into our daily routines, team routines, to support resilience rather than and help prevent situations rather than reacting? I mean, I can answer that firstly. Fiona, I'm sure will add stuff. For me, it's all about creating opportunities in a proactive way for these wellbeing conversations. So it's about, rather than waiting for staff to ask for help, creating situations where you can offer help. Practical things is, I know in my management supervision, every month when I meet with staff, I'll check in and ask for a wellbeing rating. So along with having done your mandatory training, I'll ask, on a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate yourself? 10 being great, 0 being rubbish. And the number just opens up a conversation. So I'm less worried around whether it'll be a 3 or a 9, but it's a noticing, oh, okay, you were a 3 this month, but you were an 8 last month. What's happening? Is there a conversation we need to have there? So there's a regular, normal checking in. Someone else once said to me, which I think is a great idea, is what we're quite good at doing our annual staff surveys. That gives us a point in time sort of barometer check. But actually at the end of each shift, you know when you go through the customs and you hit your green smiley face or your red sad face, have your pebbles in a jar, or have a sort of smiley face, sad face on a door at the end of the shift, and ask staff just to plonk at how they rated the shift. And it just gives you a sense check, and then you can bring that into your team meeting. Goodness, we've had a tough week, people have rated it. I'm answering with an impatient head on, just how you can build some of these conversations in. Fiona, I'm sorry if I'm putting you on the spot, but
no, it's fine.
Community lens, you've got some ideas as well.
No, I think that they sound like really good ideas. I think in the community, I suppose one of the biggest challenges is that there's so, which we've mentioned today, there's such a compromise on the opportunities to connect, and people are remote working and all, kind of all over the place. So it's about creating structure where there can be check-in, that there can be a space to have that chat that ordinarily you would have in the kitchen, or making your lunch, or have a good moan or a swear, or whatever it is that you need to do, but making those kind of informal structures built in, having time between meetings so that there's a little bit of respite and a time for processing. I think one of the things I've certainly really missed is the travelling. So it was time to process, it was time to kind of digest things that had happened, and we're kind of very easily in this kind of relentless process. So I think in addition to what Kerry said, it's just kind of making time for connection and digestion of experiences.
And I think again, across inpatient community, just the narrative, it's okay not to be okay, and modelling that, it again creates an environment where it's all right to open the door and have the conversation. Someone, Deborah's just put in the chat, I know I've mentioned the psychological first aid slides. They should be in the staff health and wellbeing section as well, but I've heard that the link is not working at the moment. I'm literally meeting with Tracy Needham after this, who's leading the trust staff and health and wellbeing delivery really, and I know she's already asked me about that, so we'll re-establish that link and fix it if it's not working at the moment. So everything sits in that staff health and wellbeing hub on our intranet. Okay, thanks, Kerry. So I think we're up to time. So just to say thank you, everybody, for your time today. The recording, as we've said, will be available, and take very good care of yourselves. Thanks for coming. And give those capes a wash. Thank you.